Hi everyone, I'm Tom Bliss with the University of Georgia Shellfish Lab, and I'm going to moderate this section on state updates. And it's really going to be, each state's going to get about 5 minutes to go through. If there are any questions or time left, we're going to save it to the end. And since there's so many people up here, I'm actually going to let them introduce themselves instead of taking up time right now. But yeah, this is a really good way just to get a quick update on where things stand in each state. And yeah, so with that, I'll hand it off to Eric, and we'll get going.
Okay, thank you, Tom. And just want to acknowledge Beth and Bill and Oyster South, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about the North Carolina shellfish mariculture update. I apologize to any folks from North Carolina that may have seen my talk a couple weeks ago at the North Carolina Aquaculture Development Conference. It's essentially the same talk, but I have less time, so I'm going to go quite fast. In North Carolina, our mariculture industry comprises oysters, clams, and soft crabs. We have bottom and water column leases. I've been trying to track the capacity, but I haven't been able to get the data back beyond 2020. But we did have, in 2021, 420 leases covering 2,198 acres. That was an increase of 10 and 6% respectively. In terms of shellfish water column leases, we have been tracking the number of shellfish water column leases for about a little over a decade now. In 2021, we had 119 water column leases. That was up 19% from the previous year, and they covered 365 acres. That was up 20% or 22% from 2020. We also have been tracking the number of lease applications going back to 2009. You can see in 2017, everybody and their brother decided they wanted to get rich quick growing oysters in North Carolina. So in 2017, we had almost an exponential increase in the number of shellfish lease applications, mainly water column leases. So, but in 2021, we had 25 water column applications. That was up 16%, and 29 bottom lease applications, up 17%. And you can see we had a couple of valleys. In 2018, we had Hurricane Florence. 2019, we had Hurricane Dorian, but that didn't really seem to slow us down. And then 2020, we had COVID, of course, but nice to see an uptick in 2021, people still applying for leases. Most of our production is based on half shell production, or our increased in industry growth is really for the half shell market. So in terms of oyster production, and we had our best year ever, like by far, last year in 2021. It was over a 50% increase to our next highest year of production. So 58,760 bushels, up 111%, and again, highest ever. In terms of wild oyster production, you can see it's been trending down over the last 12 years or so. Although the last 3 years have been a little bit stable, and we did have a little uptick. So nice to see the wild harvest stable and potentially increasing. In terms of farm gate value, farmed oysters, again, best year ever, coincides with production by far, 4.75 million farm gate value. Again, highest ever, and by a lot. If we compare that to farm gate value of wild harvest, I think this is the third year or fourth year where farmed raised production, farm gate value has exceeded wild harvest. So that trend's continuing. Hard clams, I'm not going to go into this, so breeze through this relatively quickly, but had a great year last year as well. Not the highest ever, but we produced 4,467 bushels. That was up 540% from 2020. So 2020 COVID really killed our farmed clam production. Fourth highest year ever. Here's just a comparison with the wild harvest. Farm gate value. People are paying more for clams. Nice to see that. Wild harvest again, comparison. Soft crabs, real quick, it's been trending down over the last 12 years, but not too bad last year. It was up 91%, but it was the fourth lowest in the last 12 years. Farm gate value of 1.44 million. In terms of people applying for permits, trending down over the last 12 years. And I want to put a shout out if anyone knows any peeler crab sources anywhere in the Gulf or South Atlantic. Our shedder operations in North Carolina are starving for peeler crabs. So if you know any commercial fishers for peelers, I'd love to hear about it and share those with our shedding operations in North Carolina. Awesome year for oysters, even in the middle of COVID. Great year for clams as well. Not bad for crabs. And we had a really nice year last year. No hurricanes, no mass mortalities. And even though we're dealing with COVID, we still saw a really strong increase. And I'm going to end it there. Thank you to North Carolina Division of Marine Fisheries for supplying the raw data that I used to put all the graphs together. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. I am Sarah Pettigo. I'm the shellfish aquaculture specialist with South Carolina Sea Grant, and I'll be giving the South Carolina state update today. To start with an industry overview, so there are a total of 36 mariculture permits in the state right now. This is a mix of clam and oyster culture using both on and off bottom growing techniques. And so although the industry is relatively small, there's been quite an increase in the in off-bottom oyster farming over the past half decade, and that's greatly attributed to advancements in gear technology or the floating bags. So the last off-bottom farm was permitted in 2019. So single oyster mariculture has increased significantly over the past around a half decade again. So from 2014 to 2019, there was a 750% increase in single oyster, with just under 140,000 produced in 2014 to the peak of just over 1.19 million in 2019. In 2020, there was a slight decline in production, likely due to COVID-associated impacts, and then in 2021, around 1,050,000 oysters were produced. And so when talking with growers, they're expressing that the demand for single oysters has recovered strongly, and if they had more product to sell, that they would. And many of the farmers are positioning themselves to expand their operations, as many are currently operating under their permitted gear and water space allowances at this time. Then looking at revenue for this mariculture oyster production. So again, following the same trend, and in 2021, it was around 954,000. And a side note here, just from observations looking at restaurant menus, single oysters are going somewhere between $3 to $4 a piece in local restaurants. To talk about just a few of the challenges that seem to be present in South Carolina, on the technical side, availability of seed seems to be a constraint. And so there is limited hatchery capacity in South Carolina, and currently there's no public research hatchery. One update is that the moratorium on importing seed north of South Carolina was lifted in April of 2020, and that has allowed great access, or much greater access to seed for farmers, along with the establishment of a small private hatchery in the state. On that research front, so we do have limited shellfish aquaculture research capacity in the state. And so for that, Sea Grant has recently partnered with Coastal Carolina University and an economist at the University of South Carolina to estimate the return on investment for investing in certain R&D research scenarios. And that's just to make a case for furthering aquaculture research in the state. On the regulatory front, many of the growers are noting difficulty in the permitting process, costs associated with this, as well as the time that's taken to be permitted. And in many cases, this is reaching much farther than a year. And a bit about workforce development. So there seems to be a lack of access to the industry in South Carolina. This may be partially attributed to the lack of training or demonstration opportunities in the state. And when talking with growers, it seems that there's also difficulty in finding a reliable and willing labor source. Then, as a closing note, Sea Grant recently completed a report to estimate the economic contribution of off-bottom farming in South Carolina. And so this is in terms of jobs created and economic output. So when looking at direct, indirect, and induced economic effects, as well as restaurant sales of oysters, the total contribution of the off-bottom mariculture industry is 130 jobs and over 8.7 in total output. And I guess we'll save questions for later.
Yeah, so I'll just give a quick update on what's going on in Georgia. We're relatively new to the industry, and really our biggest change is that finally in 2019, our legislators completely overhauled our shellfish lease legislation so that we could actually go into oyster farming. Prior to then, we were a wild harvest only state, and our state didn't have authority to allow for the use of gear for aquaculture. So after many years of working with them, we were finally able to get that hurdle passed. We do have one farm that is farming intertidally now, the McIntoshes, who are here at the conference. So, you can talk to them more to learn more about what they're having to do. But what we're very excited about is that in addition to the intertidal wild leases, the state also now has water column leases, which will allow for the use of floating gear. 6 of those leases, ranging in 7.5 to 10 acres each, have been awarded. None are in production yet. They're all still going through Army Corps permitting at this stage. And our Corps office is all new to this because we have to work with the Savannah District. So they are, they've never dealt with this before. So for them, this is quite a learning experience. But it's good to see things are moving forward finally. And really what that leads to us is our state has allowed for summer harvest to move forward, but they do not have any rules on the books on what their Vibrio control plan is. So we'll be working with the state this year to help establish the Vibrio control plan so that hopefully as these farms come online, they'll have the ability to sell 12 months of the year and not just 8 months of the year right now. And as we lead into this, as Sarah mentioned, training is a big thing. This is new to Georgia, so we are working to get the training program. This was the one that was developed in North Carolina and with South Carolina as well. They have implemented that program successfully up in North Carolina, and we will be offering it this summer, and we were able to get some Sea Grant funds to cover the cost for the first 20 individuals to get into that. So it's very exciting to start seeing things rolling forward and moving along here to where we can get more personnel and people out on the water. And along with that, one of the things that we're very happy about doing is, in addition to the industry side, is also doing the outreach side. So we've got a EE Blue grant, which we are doing to get the idea of aquaculture out into, introduced to kids. So we're working with Oyster South as well as the Georgia Aquarium. And so we're developing a curriculum and a display to go out to talk to kids probably in the 5th to middle school grades about the social, economic, and environmental impacts in, parts of aquaculture. So it's exciting to start seeing that come together and find different ways to get information out there to, kids coming into this that still a lot of people in Georgia don't know Georgia even has a coastline. So the more we can do to get kids in the Atlanta area and along that visit our education facility along the coast is just extremely important. And so as that comes along together, if successful, our idea is hopefully this can be something that other states can adopt or use in their programs as well. So we'll be getting more information out on that as it comes together. And then finally, just real quickly, in addition to our main focus on oyster aquaculture, our goal, one of the goals at our lab is really to help diversify our industry, where we see oysters and clams being the core of our industry, but we are also interested in other native bivalves that we have there. So we are doing a current program looking at southern clams, and really it's the post-harvest processing side of those, but getting better growth rates for how they perform in Georgia. And then we're also interested in, getting blood arcs onto the market. They grow well in our area. So those are other areas that we see coming in addition to oysters, but it's just exciting to see the changes that are starting to take place. And with that, I'll pass it off to Leslie.
Hi, I'm Leslie Sturmer with the University of Florida giving the Florida Report. So, unlike Georgia, though, but Florida is still a relatively new industry, actually getting started as a result of the fishery failure in Apalachicola Bay in 2012. That bay produced probably 90% of the state's landing, and it is still not recovered, and harvesting is suspended there. That was followed in the next year, in which the governor and cabinet approved the use of water column leases on our shellfish aquaculture areas, that removing a regulatory constraint on use of off-bottom gear. A local community college also began offering an oyster certification course or program. So currently there are over 400 acres of water column leases in 12 coastal counties, most of them located on the west coast of Florida. The industry continues to grow in terms of acreage, with just the past 2 years an additional 95 acres of water column leases let. New aquaculture use zone in Apalachicola Bay, as well as individual leases ranging in 1 to 10 acres in sizes. So we look at the production over the past 6 years. In 2016, about 3 million cultured oysters produced, going up to 4.9 million last year. You see a drop in production in the COVID year 2020. There's over 125 certified growers in the state, and there's over 45 certified wholesalers as well. Talking about oyster seed availability, we have 2 clam hatcheries on the west coast of Florida that diversified to produce oyster seed, with one of those hatcheries probably providing the majority of the seed in the state. We have 3 oyster hatcheries that developed in the Panhandle, and state rules do allow for out-of-state purchases of seed with certain restrictions, and I'll come back to this in just a sec. In terms of gear, and I didn't follow through there, but in terms of gear, most of our growers are using the floating bag systems, although some are using cages as well as adjustable longline systems, and we do have an equipment distributor located in the Panhandle. Probably the number one constraint and concern of our new industry is the lack of reliable, consistent seed supply. That has limited our growers from reaching their business plans, as well as for our industry to really expand. There's one bright spot. We do now currently have Florida West Coast specific tetraploids, and that's due to the hard work and effort of Scott Rickard and 4 Cs. We have other risks that the industry faces, especially on the Gulf Coast, and that's, of course, hurricanes and tropical storms. You can see over the past 2 years the number of events that have affected oyster growing areas on the West Coast. Hurricane Michael came ashore in 2018 as a Category 5 hurricane affecting 4 coastal counties. As a result, NOAA Fisheries has dedicated about $7.8 million in relief, and with direct payments now to shellfish growers. In fact, this is the first time I think that marine aquaculture has been identified in one of these type of federal relief programs. But like most of them, they're never timely, with applications just going out the first of this year. Just as a reminder that UF, along with Auburn Shellfish Lab and LSU, produced a series of fact sheets, preparational guides to help with hurricane preparedness. They can be downloaded at this website, and I think Rusty Grice is also going to have some available tonight for a handout. So I asked a few of our growers to kind of comment on the state of things in Florida, and here's what they had to say, and I can't hardly read these to get through this quickly. So comments about problems meeting the markets due to lack of oysters on a farm level. Another issue we faced last year, kind of unprecedented, is that red tide affected most of our oyster growing areas on the west coast of Florida. So industry's working with researchers and agencies on trying to improve management protocols. Part-time grower talked about the time and effort involved and doesn't have enough capital or can hire, I can't even read these. Or the risk is too great to make the jump for full-time or to hire help. Comment about cost and availability of gear and the fact that we don't have equipment manufacturers located in the South or Gulf Coast, and that limits the time frame for freight and so forth. And then I like this holistic approach answer here, is that it's time to look at the overall health of our oyster culture industry. It's been 6 years really since it started. It's time to work with agencies and review policies and so forth to ensure a robust, healthy industry. And lastly, I think we've had some great publicity over the past couple of years, both on a state and regional level. That's it.
I'm Rusty Grice with the Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant Consortium and the Auburn University Shellfish Lab. And I'm only going to speak to off-bottom cultured oysters. We use floating gear, and we have adjustable longline system. So it's no bottom leases or alternative oyster culture. These are off-bottom oyster farm, commercial oyster farm results. So the 2021 harvest reported to the Alabama Department of Public Health, who's our authority, there were 4,711,166 oysters reported for harvest. That came from, again, according to our authority, 11 commercial oyster farms that are certified in the state. My thinking is there are probably more farms, but we've seen farms working on the same leases. They tend to sort of form a loose cooperative, so they generate one harvest report for perhaps multiple farmers there. Interestingly, we have a scenario in Alabama where one of our farms is also a processor, so it's not, farm gate's difficult to get a good number for because they're selling directly to the end users and restaurants and such, so they may report 80, 90 cents a piece, which is not actually their farm gate, but just in personal conversation, and a good estimate would be around 50 cents a piece, so approximately $2.4 million. So again, we have probably 120 acres permitted. We've had some folks drop out and some new leases come online, and I would estimate there's about 80 acres in actual use. So that's a 213% increase over harvest. We were sort of flat from, as far as harvest numbers from 2019 to 2020, so it was nice to see the hardworking folks have a good year. And again, just based on surveys, we'd estimate about 50 jobs in the industry. Some of those are seasonal and part-time, of course. We do have a hatchery and 3 nurseries that are in the state. And again, all of this information, or the asterisks, are information reported by the authority in the state. So just again, these are results only for oysters commercially raised from seed. So I know it gets a little confusing out there, but I'll yield the rest of my time to the great state of Mississippi. So.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jason Ryder, and I am the Biological Program Coordinator for the Mississippi Department of Marine Resources. And just to get started, I work for the agency. Off bottom, aquaculture is one component. My slides will outline our agency's goals and accomplishment for 2021. So off bottom is one component, but it's not the only component. So the first thing, what is our goal is to rebuild and enhance oyster reef production and balance the size classes in the state of Mississippi. As you can see with this graph, our numbers for on-bottom oysters have just been horrible over the last couple of years. And we're really trying to do anything and everything that we can to bring those numbers up. One avenue is off-bottom aquaculture, but we also want to restore our public reefs, public and private reefs. Secondary goals, of course, are ecosystem services, water quality, and shoreline protection. So with that, we'll go into some of our accomplishments and our current activities. But some of our accomplishments are we have updated Title 22, which is our regulatory body the agency houses. To accommodate off-bottom aquaculture, we got rid of a lot of old laws or rules and implemented some new things that accommodate both on and off-bottom oyster culture. I know we've talked about it earlier today, but our Marine Patrol Agency has a hard time translating between the two activities, and they're not very similar at all. So that has taken a lot of training. We worked with them intensely, and we have, I think, got to a good point. We have created permits. We've created more paperwork than I care to admit, but it is getting to a point that everyone on the water at our agency and then harvesting oysters understands their role and how they should be harvested or grown. We've also done an oyster restoration and recovery plan. As you saw with that graph, we are looking at every option available to bring oysters in the state of Mississippi. That document is available online on our website, and it just outlines, again, the activities that we're taking to enhance our area. And then we're trying to make it a little bit easier for on-bottom leasing in the state. And historically, you have to have virgin ground without any oysters. We're trying to make some rules and accommodations for those guys that can jumpstart private industry to say if they want to come back to Mississippi and really put in some money and time to rebuild their leases, we want to help as much as we can. So with that, we do some cultivation every year. We did about 160 total acres in cultivation last year. That happens through May through June. We have a 60-foot boat. And as you can see, these are some western reefs that we have on the western side of Mississippi. We identify areas that are in poor shape, we cultivate them, and then we'll plant those, or we won't plant those. We'll check those for size classes later in the year. We also do culture planting. So with this, we have the ability to target small areas. We did about 200 acres of oyster culture planting in this past year. Those were, again, areas that need some help, need some substrate on the bottom that we think can grow some oysters and has oysters surrounding them, but we really need a jump start in that area. So the next one we do is reef assessments. We're always diving. We did 175 square meter samples, and then we also did 124 one-minute dredge tows. What that does, as you can see with this map, it does identify the good areas and some bad areas. The green is live oysters to a certain amount, and then the red is, of course, dead. As you can see, we have more red than green. We're trying to switch that, but we need to know what areas are good. And one thing we like to do is put our hands on the bottom to see what the substrate is. We have a lot of mud in Mississippi, soft, muddy bottom, and it could be the size of the stage that it is hard bottom, and then you go 100 yards and it's nothing but mud. If we do have side scan capabilities, but we feel that getting in the water and really getting down there and sampling what's on the bottom helps us. So off-bottom aquaculture, we did have 17 harvesters last year. That's active harvesters that bought licenses and harvested some amount of product. Our off-bottom program started in 2018, and I really don't want to make excuses, but we did have a rough go. In 2018, we started. In 2019, we had Bonnie Carey. In 2020, we had Hurricane Zeta. Those guys that are doing it had a really hard time those couple years. Last year's numbers are pretty low, and as you know, I mean, it's a new industry for us. We want to get that up, but we think we can get there if we don't have some environmental impacts this year. We have the opportunity to harvest a lot more than what's on the board right now. We have just over 3 million oyster seed in the water, and this year I think we went up a little bit on that number for 2021. Also, sanitary surveys is part of our agency's work, and then source point source point pollutions. Up and down the Gulf Coast, we identify areas that are problem childs and try to see if we can help with the coast municipalities and or county officials to see if we can help some of those out. One activity that we're doing is a remote set facility. We have a two-phase project. We're in phase 1 of that project. It's a two-phase project, like I said. The first one is design and feasibility to see if it's feasible and how much it's going to cost us. We have gotten through that phase. We did a small sample last year, deployed about 11 million oysters, and the proposed project is at full capacity to set 2.5 billion annually. The thing that we wanted to look at with this program is it cost feasible for us to do this. And we have pretty much determined that we have a pretty good deployment cost. So remote set is something that our state is looking into. I think we're going to get through phase 1, and if we can get the design and feasibility checked off, that has to go to our governor's office and be approved. And then, I'm out of time. We'll move on to phase 2 and build it out. Yeah, Rusty gave me his time. And then the final slide I have is a marine fisheries dry lab that is GOMESA funded, of course, and we're trying to get all of our water and tissue samples, also wet storage, done in the state of Mississippi instead of shipping it out. We think that's important. We're excited about that, and I'll get off the stage. Thank you, Rusty, for your time.
Hey everybody, I'm Brian Callum again from Louisiana Sea Grant and LSU. So just a brief update for Louisiana. We have pretty much, give or take the same amount of farmers that we had doing off-bottom aquaculture the last time we had a meeting for Oyster South, which is about 8, and with a few more at various stages in planning and permitting in the process. We have, well, one park with 2 areas, though I guess it's technically 2 parks. Aquaculture parks, pre-permitted mariculture zones around Grand Isle, Louisiana, which is where most of the off-bottom activity is focused. Just under about 100 acres total in the state are permitted for off-bottom aquaculture, which is kind of incredible considering there's about 500,000 acres of oyster leases. So clearly off-bottom oyster culture is underutilized, which is part of the reason we have that grants program to support expansion. Right now, there's 2 hatcheries in Louisiana. We have our state hatchery on Grand Isle, which provides seed and larvae to the industry, as well as a private hatchery, which is taking orders for this year. We have, I don't know if 4 nurseries is accurate anymore, but we have a few of the farmers are integrating nursery operations to provide seed both for themselves and to sell to other farmers. These numbers are sort of rough estimates right now because we've had some pretty big impacts from COVID, as everybody else did, and then several massive hurricanes which hit Louisiana, Hurricane Zeta, followed by Hurricane Ida, both of which pretty much wiped everybody out each time. Either a total loss of gear or a total loss of the crop, and in some cases both. So, you know, that's why some of these numbers, the farmers are still getting back up on their feet from that. But there's hope. Some of the farmers that we have in Louisiana use a variety of gear types. You know, we're still seeing a lot of experimentation with prefab systems, with guys modifying or designing their own gear, either floating or on bottom cages or floating bags. So we're seeing a lot of innovation, a lot of R&D happening in this area. And I think there's a lot of potential to develop some gear that can handle some of the conditions that we see, at least in our part of the Gulf, that some of the gear currently has issues with from time to time. So speaking with the industry, you know, we have a lot of concerns of freshwater impacts. Most of the off-bottom oyster aquaculture activities are very close to the Mississippi River, so we get a lot of freshwater input, sometimes for extended periods of time, and sometimes when it's pretty hot outside, which we all know is bad for the oysters. We have a couple major coastal restoration projects right next to a lot of this off-bottom oyster activity, which are projected to massively impact the environment in those areas, which are going to have an impact on oyster culture. So those are some main concerns. As everybody else is concerned, so are the farmers in Louisiana with seed availability. Both quantity and timing has been an issue. And then the possibility for expansion. In Louisiana, you can't get a new oyster lease because of a moratorium that is currently being rolled back, but it's going to be a long process. So you have to find somebody that already has an oyster lease to get to either sublet or to sell to you. But that opens up the availability of parks. You know, the pre-permitted areas are really attractive. We have one in Grand Isle now. We're developing one in the western part of the state in Lake Calcasieu in Cameron Parish, where the state is reallocating some of the public oyster bed areas for this process. And a bill to do that is passing through the state legislature right now. And then, you know, the last major concern is the impacts that we've had from storms, you know, getting back up on our feet, and then thinking about future impacts of storms. How can we better shore up our operations to handle, you know, the energy from these storms, or to better prepare, you know, and then also things like crop insurance and whatnot for the losses that are experienced in these storms. We do have a big project going on now looking at mooring systems for these off-bottom farms with some engineers at LSU. So we'll have some information on that in the future. All right.
Hi, I'm Mario Marquez, Texas Sea Grant out of Texas A&M. So we're the babies. We just started. So sorry, Georgia. Sorry, Florida. Yeah. So as of 2019, House bill passed, and we started oyster aquaculture. The program wasn't started till 2020, and then obviously the pandemic hit. So that really just threw a wrench in this industry that's starting. So Texas is doing nothing but off-bottom aquaculture. But we're doing it a little bit differently. Not me, Texas is. So the thing is that because we're actually Texas is splitting up the regions to the northern, the mixing zone, and southern regions. And the reason for that is because there's a difference between the genetics. It's still Crossostria virginica, but there's been some genetic drift from the northern and southern strains because of the lower Texas coast. It's extremely hypersaline, so these oysters have adapted to extremely hypersaline conditions where 38 parts per thousand is a good day, and they're thriving in this. So Texas decided to really isolate it to where you'll see the red zone is the mixing zone. That's around the Corpus area, and then north is that's the northern strain, to where there's been some peer-reviewed literature where they say that the northern strain in Texas is more similar genetically to an oyster in the East Coast than it is to a southern oyster, which is only like 200-300 miles away. So we're doing that, and you can see in the stars, these are the 3 farms that have actually just gotten permitted. So it's got a good geographic range along the Texas coast. So we've got 3 farms. Texas Oyster Company was the first one. It's about 10 acres, and they harvested about 1.5 million seed. And then second in Galveston, the northern coast, Barrier Beauties, about 500,000. And the last one that just got permitted about a week ago, that's in the middle coast, and that's a 5-acre farm. So unfortunately, we did not have a harvest. We just missed it by like 2 weeks. So we don't have oysters to bring to shuck and tell, but we're expecting to have our first harvest in about 2 weeks. So that's pretty exciting. Along with that, there's a lot of research being done in Palacios, Texas, the Heart Research Institute with Texas A&M Corpus Christi. They're doing a lot of research with grow-out methods, and we've actually got on the research farm, we've got all 4 types of grow-out systems: floating cages, floating bags, ALS, and foot farm. So that's really cool. And we're doing a lot of baseline studies with conditioning indices and really just seeing that. And then in Flower Bluff, Corpus Christi, AgriLife with Texas A&M Corpus Christi, that's being managed by Dr. Chris Hollenbeck. They're doing oyster conditioning, spatial genetics, and spawning of the northern and southern different kind of seeds. As well as, we actually do not have a hatchery set up in Texas yet, but the Palacios Marine Agriculture Research is planning, they're actually in development of a hatchery in Palacios, Texas to help accommodate for seed. So one of the caveats that we're having, because of the genetics of Texas, is that we cannot get seed from other states. We're actually having to send our broodstock to other out-of-state hatcheries and kind of beg them if they can spawn for us, but it's kind of worked recently. So, but hopefully with that hatchery that's being built, it'll help ameliorate that problem. And there is also an oyster nursery in queue of getting permitted. So that should be also helpful. We've had, it says 3, there's actually 4. We've actually had 4 workshops for oyster education and training for potential oyster farmers, because Texas does not know anything about oyster or aquaculture. And we've actually had a good turnout. We trained over 70 participants, full different ranges, from lawyers to students, everything. And it's been really good. It's our workshops, and that's kind of it.
All right, that leaves us a few minutes for a couple questions, if anybody has any of them for any of the updates from any of the states. If not,
So did anybody add up the production from all the southern states? What did we produce?
oh, yeah, Rusty.
Yeah, I forgot to mention the trade show. We're sponsored Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant, and we're asking for feedback from current farmers, former farmers, potential farmers. If you'll come by and sign up for that, we also have a nice little treat for you. So please stop by and see all the vendors today.
I have a question, Tom, if I may, to Jason. So your remote setting rehabilitation efforts, what culture are you using?
Oyster shell.
Okay, so you're able to get a hold of it in a
So,
reliable
yeah.
fashion?
Yeah, so right now, like I said, it's a small scale. We didn't need that much last year, but at full production, we will need a lot, and I think we're just going to buy it as it comes available, and always try to keep it continuously purchased.
Yeah, I'm particularly interested in anyone who's trying to use aggregate for culture. So just wondering if you were. All right, thank you.
So my question to the panel was, did anybody, or the audience, did anybody add up the production from last year? So what is the South producing? Nope. Bill?
I will add it
We'll
up,
have
but I
that
don't.
We'll have that answer.
All right, thank you, and yeah, I guess we'll turn it back over to you. Yep.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, panel. Appreciate it.